The ferryman, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the island's shore, merely grunted as Dean stepped onto the rickety wooden dock. The air, thick and tasting of salt and decay, pressed in immediately, a palpable weight against his skin. Dean clutched the worn leather strap of his satchel, its contents, a few changes of clothes, a well-used compass, and a collection of antique charts, feeling heavier than they should. The boat, a squat, oil-stained vessel, idled for a moment, its engine thrumming a low, guttural note that seemed to vibrate in Dean's teeth, then turned, slicing through the slate-gray water and vanishing into the encroaching fog. He was alone. The island itself was a jagged scar against the bruised sky, its peak swallowed whole by the swirling mist. A narrow, uneven path, slick with perpetual dampness, snaked upwards from the dock. As Dean began his ascent, his boots crunching on loose shale, he caught a glimpse of something ancient and formidable through a momentary thinning in the fog, a sprawling, skeletal structure of dark stone, clinging precariously to a higher ridge. It was the remote monastery, a place whispered about in hushed tones by the ferryman, its purpose now long forgotten, its windows like vacant eyes staring out to sea. The climb was arduous, each step a testament to the island's indifference. The wind, a constant, mournful companion, whipped at his coat, carrying with it the scent of brine and something else, something earthy and damp, like decaying vegetation and whetstone. He kept his gaze fixed on the path, unwilling to look back, unwilling to dwell on the fresh wound of his past. This place, this desolate rock, was meant to be a balm, a stark, uncompromising canvas for a new beginning. He hoped. Finally, the path leveled, giving way to a small, windswept plateau. There, silhouetted against the churning gray of the sky, stood the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It wasn't grand, nor was it picturesque. It was a stoic sentinel, battered and bowed by decades of Atlantic gales, its whitewash flaking like old skin, its windows opaque with salt spray. A squat, stone structure, it seemed to hunch into itself, as if bracing for another onslaught from the elements. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, guarded a patch of overgrown, wind-stunted grass. The front door, a heavy slab of sea-weathered oak, was secured with a padlock the size of his fist, encrusted with rust. The lock groaned, then clicked with surprising ease, a sound sharp and final in the quiet. He pushed the door inward. It wasn't just the smell of an old and used house, it was the smell of something waiting. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning a deep, resonant complaint beneath his weight. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light, tiny, frantic specters. He moved slowly, his boots scuffing against the gritty floor. A few shelves, bowed with age, lined one wall, holding nothing but a scattering of seashells and a single, petrified piece of driftwood. It was stark, almost monastic in its emptiness, a stark contrast to the life his grandfather must have lived here. Dean felt a peculiar tremor, not of fear, but of profound loneliness. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn timber of a doorframe, feeling the grit and splinters. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sigh of the ocean and the soft, insistent whistle of the wind finding its way through unseen cracks. But then, a new sound began to assert itself, subtle at first, then growing more distinct, a faint, percussive thump. Thump. Thump from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the creak of settling wood, nor the distant clang of the lighthouse mechanism. It was too regular, too deliberate. Dean froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained his ears, every muscle tensing. The thump. Thump. Thump continued, a slow, deliberate heartbeat emanating from the earth itself. The sound seemed to resonate directly into his skull, a low, resonant vibration that felt ancient and deep. It was coming from below, from the very foundations of the cottage. He told himself it was the sea, perhaps, waves crashing against an unseen cavern beneath the island, or maybe just some old, failing machinery left by his grandfather. But the rhythm was too steady, too insistent. It felt alive. He pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the room, searching for an explanation, for any sign of a hatch or a trapdoor. Nothing. His gaze fell upon the wall beside the fireplace, where the whitewash had peeled away in a large, irregular patch. Beneath, etched into the exposed stone, was a series of crude, swirling symbols, unlike anything he had ever seen on any chart or map. They were deep, purposeful gouges, not random scratches. They seemed to writhe, like ancient script describing something vast and formless, something that yearned for the deep. As his finger passed over the final, most intricate symbol, the rhythmic thump. Thump. Thump from beneath the floor intensified, a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the very stones of the cottage. He pulled his hand back sharply, his heart now hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, mirroring the insistent pulse from below. He watched the fairy silhouette diminish into the gray haze, a final link to the world he'd left behind, severing with each receding ripple. Solitude, he'd told himself, was precisely what he needed. Here, on this craggy outcropping of granite and wind-battered scrub, he hoped to map a new course for his shattered life. The cottage loomed at the top of a winding, overgrown path, a stoic sentinel against the relentless elements. Its whitewashed walls were peeling, the windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating a scene of disuse and neglect. His grandfather, a man Dean barely remembered, had lived out his last days here, a hermit by choice, or so the family lore claimed. He set about the mundane tasks of making the place habitable. He opened windows, letting the briny air scour away the stale scent of age and abandonment. He swept, he scrubbed, he tried to impose order on the chaos, a familiar ritual that usually calmed the restless currents within him. But here, the order felt fragile, a thin veneer over something deeper and untamed. By the second day, a peculiar rhythm began to assert itself. Dean, a cartographer by trade, possessed an almost obsessive sensitivity to patterns and anomalies. He'd always prided himself on his keen observation, his ability to read the subtle shifts in terrain, the almost imperceptible changes that hinted at larger forces at play. And the tides here were wrong. They receded too far, too fast, exposing stretches of slick, dark rock usually swallowed by the waves. Then, with an unnatural eagerness, they surged back in, crashing against the shore with a violence that felt less like nature and more like an impatient, hungry breath. He checked his grandfather's old tide charts, faded and brittle, comparing them to his own observations. There was no correlation. The charts were for a different sea, or perhaps a different time. But the explanations felt hollow, like words rattling in an empty drum. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, a mournful sigh through the eaves, or the distant shriek of gulls. But they persisted, especially at dusk, when the fog began its slow, creeping crawl across the island. They were too low to discern, too indistinct to form words, yet they carried a distinct tonal quality, a cadence that was not quite natural. Sometimes, they seemed to coil around the cottage itself, pressing against the glass, as if a chorus of unseen voices exhaled just beyond the walls. Dean found himself pausing, coffee cup halfway to his lips, straining to catch a coherent fragment, but they always dissolved into the general din of the island's wild symphony, the ceaseless roar of the ocean, the rustle of sparse vegetation, the cry of unseen birds. He was alone, profoundly alone, and the mind, he knew, abhorred a vacuum. One blustery afternoon, while clearing out a small, damp study filled with his grandfather's nautical instruments and yellowed maps, Dean found it. Tucked beneath a pile of mildewed fishing nets, half hidden by a collapsed shelf, was a journal. The pages within were swollen, some fused together, others brittle and crumbling at the edges. Dean handled it with a strange reverence, a sudden, inexplicable premonition prickling at the back of his neck. He carried it to the kitchen table, the strongest light in the cottage, and carefully began to separate the pages. His grandfather's handwriting was spidery and erratic, sometimes neat, sometimes scrawled in a frantic rush. The early entries spoke of lighthouse duties, weather observations, mundane island life. But as Dean delved deeper, the tone shifted. Not precise cartographic drawings. Crude, visceral representations, tangled masses of what looked like seaweed. With an unsettling organic quality, like sinews or veins, abstract symbols that resembled ancient glyphs, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse from the page, and most unsettling of all, distorted, elongated figures, barely human, with gaping mouths and vacant eyes, their forms indistinct, as if rendered underwater. And then he found the phrase, repeated again and again, scrawled in increasingly desperate hand, the deep song. His grandfather had underlined it, sometimes encircled it, sometimes surrounded it with a flurry of question marks and exclamation points. There were warnings too, fragmented in cryptic it calls, the pull, below the light. One entry, dated just weeks before his grandfather's disappearance, read the monastery bells no longer drown it out. They never could. The old ways fail. It sees. Dean looked up, his gaze drawn instinctively to the distant, jagged peak of the island where the remote monastery stood, a gray stone silhouette against the perpetually bruised sky. He hadn't thought much of it, just another desolate landmark, but now it felt like a silent, accusing witness. He closed the journal, the heavy thud resonating in the quiet room. The anomalous tides, the phantom voices, the grandfather's descent into apparent madness, it was all too much to dismiss as coincidence, too unsettling to attribute solely to his own troubled mind. He had sought solitude, but it felt as though something else had found him first. The rumble of the ferry's engine faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. Dean stood on the rickety wooden dock, the air around him a heavy shroud of salt and an inexplicable, metallic tang that puckered his tongue. The ferryman, a silhouette against the gray-green water, had not looked back, leaving Dean utterly alone. He walked, the crunch of gravel under his boots unnaturally loud, towards the lighthouse keeper's cottage. The structure, perched precariously on the cliff edge, seemed to watch him with vacant, glass eyes. Inside, the chill was bone-deep, a perpetual dampness that clung to the walls and seeped into his clothes. The first order of business was to understand. His grandfather's journal, half deciphered, lay on the scarred oak table, its pages brittle, its ink faded. Dean spent the next few hours hunched over the journal, a magnifying glass held close to the yellowed paper. His cartographer's eye, trained to spot patterns and extrapolate meaning from fragmented data, began to piece together the cryptic entries. It must be honored. What pact? What offering? He moved from the journal to the small, dusty bookshelf in the corner, filled with weather-beaten tomes on local history, maritime charts, and forgotten folklore. The author was listed as a Brother Thomas, of the remote monastery, and the publication date was nearly a century old. Dean pulled it out, a cloud of fine dust puffing into the lamplight. He began to read, scanning for keywords, for anything that might echo the journal's unsettling hints. The book detailed ancient fishing rituals, strange tides, and the periodic disappearance of small boats without a trace. A place of cyclopean architecture, where strange, luminescent flora bloomed and the very water hummed with an unnatural song. A pact. An offering. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying resonance. The local legends, preserved by the monks of the remote monastery, mirrored his grandfather's frantic scrawls. He collapsed onto the narrow cot, the sea's ceaseless roar a lullaby of impending doom. Sleep, when it came, was not a release. He dreamed of being submerged, of immense pressure crushing his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. The dream was not silent, he heard it, a vast, guttural hum that vibrated through his very bones, a sound that was both a song and a lament, utterly alien and profoundly ancient. He saw flashes, not of shapes, but of impossible geometries, structures that defied earthly physics, rising from the seabed, slick with an unidentifiable slime. He felt eyes on him, not physical eyes, but a pervasive, knowing awareness that settled upon his consciousness, exploring, tasting. His throat was raw, his lungs burning as if he had indeed been underwater. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a faint, metallic odor, like ozone and brine. As his eyes adjusted, a faint, ethereal luminescence caught his attention. On the worn wooden sill of the window, where the salt spray often collected, a patch of something glowed with a soft, otherworldly blue-green light. He stumbled towards it, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't phosphorescence from the sea. It was a growth, a thin, gelatinous film, spreading across the wood, almost like an algae, but vibrant, pulsing. A tendril of the same glowing substance snaked down the frame, disappearing behind a stack of his grandfather's old charts. He touched it, tentatively. It was cool and slick, leaving a faint, shimmering residue on his fingertip. The light was faint, yet unmistakable, an impossible bloom of life in the desolate, forgotten cottage. It was alien, beautiful, and utterly terrifying, a silent, encroaching testament to the things his grandfather had feared, the things that now stirred beneath the waves, reaching for him. The ferryman, a silhouette against the gray-green water, had vanished, leaving Dean utterly alone. The silence that descended was not peaceful, it was a hungry quiet, waiting. He turned from the churning water, his boots crunching on the shell-strewn path leading back to the cottage. The mist, always a presence on this island, seemed to thicken with each step, coiling around the gnarled roots of stunted trees. The metallic taste in his mouth intensified, a faint, bitter echo beneath the salt. Inside the cottage, the air was still and heavy, as if it had been holding its breath since he'd left. He lit the oil lamp, its hesitant glow pushing back the encroaching shadows, but not entirely dispelling the gloom that clung to the corners of the room. He poured himself a mug of lukewarm tea, his hands steady despite the lingering unease. As he brought the mug to his lips, a low, almost imperceptible hum began. It wasn't a sound heard by the ears alone, but a vibration felt in the teeth, a pressure behind the eyeballs. He paused, mug halfway to his mouth, listening. The hum faded, then returned, a deeper resonance this time, like the distant thrum of a colossal engine buried deep beneath the earth. He walked to the window, peering out into the thickening fog. The hum grew, a slow, hypnotic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the cottage. It was a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the waves, it felt ancient, fundamental. He turned back into the room, his gaze sweeping across the familiar, if sparse, furnishings. A small, tarnished brass compass that had been resting on the mantelpiece now sat several inches to the left of where he'd left it. He blinked, dismissing it as his own absent-mindedness, a trick of the dim light. But then, a heavy, leather-bound book of nautical charts, previously stacked neatly on the table beside his armchair, lay slightly askew, its spine angled awkwardly. Dean's brow furrowed. He hadn't touched either item. He picked up the book, running a thumb over its worn cover. He moved to the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin. His reflection stared back, his face pale and drawn. But as he watched, his features seemed to ripple, distort, as if submerged in water. The distortion vanished, leaving only his own shocked face staring back. He felt an urgent need to understand, to find an explanation beyond his own fraying nerves. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn walls, tapped on floorboards, pulled at drawers that had seemed permanently stuck. Behind a loose panel in the study, concealed by a stack of old fishing nets, he found a small, wooden box. Its pages were brittle, filled with a frantic, looping script that spoke of the deep, of the awakening, of the pact. It demands the offering to keep it at bay. The ocean calls. There were crude, unsettling symbols etched into the margins, repeating patterns of intertwined spirals and jagged lines that seemed to writhe on the page. Further entries spoke of wards and sacrifices, not of blood, but of isolation, of memory, of something far more insidious. It claimed her. His grandfather hadn't just lived here, he had fought something here. The hum swelled, a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through the floorboards, up his legs, into his very bones. He spun, his senses screaming. In the periphery of his vision, in the doorway leading to the bedroom, a shape coalesced. He stumbled backward, knocking over his armchair with a loud thud. The sound ripped through the suffocating hum. Gasping, Dean scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He needed answers, a way to fight this, or at least to understand what he was up against. He remembered a faint, almost illegible sketch in the journal, a crude map leading to an isolated structure on the far side of the island. A place his grandfather had marked with a single, ominous word, sanctuary. The remote monastery. It was his only lead, his only hope. He had to go. The ferryman's silhouette had melted into the gray-green expanse of the ocean, leaving Dean alone on the rickety dock. The air, thick with the smell of salt and that unsettling metallic tang, seemed to press in on him, a physical weight. He didn't linger, the cold seeping into his bones despite the heavy wool sweater. The cottage called to him, not with warmth or comfort, but with the insistent pull of the journal, a silent promise of answers, or perhaps, deeper questions. He lit the oil lamp, its hesitant flame casting dancing shadows across the cramped space. The wind, a mournful lament, rattled the single window pane, and the rhythmic sigh of the ocean was a constant, unsettling presence. He pulled the leather-bound journal onto the scarred wooden table, its pages brittle beneath his fingers. He flipped past the earlier, more mundane entries, seeking the cryptic passages, the hurried scrawls that had first stirred his unease. He focused on the sketches, intricate, geometric patterns, some resembling ancient nautical charts, others more like diagrams of unseen forces. Below them, a fragmented sentence, "The weight of the pact must be maintained. The deep song's lullaby. A temporary peace." Dean's breath hitched. Pact. His grandfather hadn't just been observing. He had been involved. He traced a finger over another entry, dated years before his grandfather's disappearance. The vibrations grow stronger. The old binding weakens. The source, the remote monastery, has warned against complacency. The rituals must be exact. The offering. Rituals. Offerings. This wasn't the work of a reclusive old man simply documenting island folklore. This was the desperate act of a guardian, a custodian of some terrible, ancient secret. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as an effect of the isolated quiet, but it grew, a persistent, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. Dean realized with a sickening jolt that his grandfather hadn't been charting the entity's movements, he had been performing a ritual to keep it dormant. The deep song was not just a metaphor, it was the entity's insidious presence, a sonic assault designed to unravel the mind. As he read, the thrumming intensified, moving from his chest to his skull, a dull ache behind his eyes. The lamp flame seemed to flicker erratically, though there was no draft. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the sensation persisted, the edges of his vision blurring, the lines of the wooden beams overhead seeming to waver. He tried to focus, to anchor himself in the tangible world of the journal, but the words began to swim. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, sharp and acrid, like old blood or rust. It wasn't just in the air, it was inside him, vibrating through his bones, resonating with something primal and terrified. His grandfather's final entries were almost illegible, a frantic scrawl of fear and desperation. It stirs. The song breaks through. The binding weakens. The chamber below. It must hold. Forgive me for failing. The chamber below. The words pulsed in Dean's mind, a sudden, blinding clarity cutting through the encroaching haze of the deep song. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the cottage, then out towards the lighthouse, its beam cutting a slow, deliberate arc through the thickening fog. He stumbled to his feet, the world tilting precariously around him. The floorboards beneath his boots felt soft, yielding, like damp sand. He pushed open the cottage door, the wind tearing at his clothes, and made his way to the lighthouse, the beam a beacon in the swirling gray. He descended, the thrumming growing louder with each step, the sense of pressure overwhelming. At the base of the lighthouse, where the stone floor met the rough, unhewn rock of the island's foundation, he paused. The deep song was a roar now, though no sound escaped his lips. He pressed his hand against the rough stone wall, feeling the vibrations travel through his palm, up his arm, into his very core. His fingers brushed against a section of rock that felt different, smoother, with a subtle, almost imperceptible seam running vertically. He pushed, the stone resisting, then with a groan that seemed to echo the sound in his head, it shifted inward, revealing a narrow, lightless opening. A gust of stagnant, freezing air billowed out, carrying with it the undeniable scent of the deep, a primal stink of decay and damp stone. This was it. The chamber below. And whatever lay within had been waiting. The low thrumming in Dean's chest, a vibration he'd first dismissed as a phantom echo of the island's ceaseless wind, now resonated with a distinct, unsettling rhythm. It was a pulse, deep and fundamental, growing steadily more insistent since he'd uncovered his grandfather's ritualistic notes. Offerings. Pacts. The words had etched themselves into his mind, painting a stark, terrifying picture of a man not simply observing island lore, but desperately maintaining a fragile truce. Dean's solitude had curdled into a suffocating dread. The journey was a blur of driving rain and oppressive fog, the kind that swallowed the world whole, leaving only the immediate, sodden track visible. Dean navigated the winding, rutted paths, the old pickup truck groaning in protest. The island itself seemed to resist his passage, branches clawing at the windows, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying kelp. Finally, the fog thinned, grudgingly revealing the silhouette of the remote monastery. The thrumming intensified, no longer just within him, but seeming to vibrate from the very ground beneath his feet. He parked the truck, its engine dying with a final, protesting shudder, leaving only the roar of the surf and the relentless internal pulse. Dean approached the main entrance, a massive, iron-bound door that sagged on rusted hinges, but it was barred from within. Moss-covered gargoyles leered down from high ledges, their features eroded by centuries of salt and wind, yet still retaining a malevolent cast. A barely perceptible seam, almost swallowed by ivy, revealed a small, heavy door, hidden in plain sight. With a grunt, he pushed. The ancient wood groaned, and the door swung inward with a drawn-out shriek of metal on stone, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy with the scent of damp rock, mildew, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that prickled his nostrils. The passage sloped downwards, the walls slick with condensation, the thrumming now a distinct, palpable vibration that made his teeth ache. He descended into the earth, each step echoing unnervingly in the confined space. The passage opened into a larger, circular chamber, carved not from rough rock, but from a smooth, obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the flashlight's beam rather than reflect it. And in the center of the chamber, pulsating with a sickening, internal light, lay the gateway. It was not a door, nor a simple hole, but a shimmering, unstable tear in the fabric of reality itself. Roughly oval, it hung suspended in the air, framed by impossible geometry that defied all understanding of angles and curves. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat that mirrored the thrumming in Dean's chest, but amplified, echoing through the very bones of the chamber. As Dean stumbled closer, compelled by an invisible force, the shimmering surface of the gateway rippled, and a vision slammed into his consciousness with the force of a tidal wave. It was not a sight seen with his eyes, but felt, perceived directly by his mind, bypassing his senses entirely. He saw the island, not as solid earth, but as a fragile, dissolving shell. Then, the vision focused. He saw himself, standing alone on the lighthouse cliff, the air around him thick with the salt spray and the entity's presence. He felt the insidious tendrils of something ancient and vast reaching out, not to grasp him physically, but to unravel his very being, to pull his mind, his soul, into that crushing, lightless domain. The thrumming in his chest became an unbearable roar, threatening to tear him apart from the inside. His grandfather hadn't been protecting the island from an inhabitant, he'd been protecting it from a domain, a vast, hungry realm that was slowly, inexorably, reaching for the world above. The pulse deepened, spread, a cold tide rising from his diaphragm into his throat, a pressure that felt less like a physical phenomenon and more like an internal occupation. His own breath hitched, no longer feeling entirely his own. He swallowed, a dry, rasping sound in the sudden, profound silence that had fallen over the island. Even the tireless gulls seemed to have ceased their cries. The air grew heavy, viscous, pressing in from all sides. It was here, now. It was in him. Dean gasped, stumbling back from the heavy oak desk where his grandfather's journal lay open. His vision blurred at the edges, the familiar lines of the room wavering, twisting into grotesque approximations of themselves. Each syllable was a hook, tugging at the frayed edges of his sanity. He was trapped. This wasn't just a lingering presence anymore, it was an active assault, a deliberate attempt to breach the final walls of his consciousness. This battle was internal, fought on the very battlefield of his mind. Get out! He clutched the journal, his knuckles white against the worn leather. This was his last hope, the only weapon he had left. His eyes scanned the dense, spidery script, frantic, skipping over familiar passages about ancient tides and forgotten pacts. He needed something definitive, something concrete. His gaze snagged on a series of symbols, etched with a different, heavier hand than the surrounding text, almost gouged into the page. Below them, a hurried, almost illegible entry, "Dot the passage through the heart of the deep. Must be sealed. Not merely contained. The old ways, the true ways, demand a return." The locus. The remote monastery. The ancient texts. They hold the key. But the price. The terrible price. Dean's breath hitched. The remote monastery. He remembered seeing a faded, almost erased notation on one of his grandfather's older, more detailed maps of the island, a small, isolated structure, far inland, shrouded by ancient, gnarled trees. A place he'd never considered visiting, dismissing it as a relic, a forgotten piece of the island's past. He turned the page, his fingers fumbling. The next entry was even more fragmented, scrawled with a desperate urgency that mirrored his own. It described a ritual, not to banish, but to seal. A final, irreversible act. It spoke of a conduit, a sacrifice, not of an animal, but of something far more precious, something intrinsically linked to the entity itself. The binding must be absolute. To close the gate, one must offer a piece of the gate itself. A tether. A life given, not taken. A willing surrender. To sever the connection. The bloodline. Dean froze. A terrible sacrifice. His grandfather had alluded to it, hinted at the cost. But this was beyond comprehension. To seal the portal, to sever the connection, required a life. A life from the very bloodline that had first awakened the entity, that had kept the pact. His bloodline. His own. He slammed the journal shut, the heavy thud echoing in the suffocating quiet. The whisper in his mind intensified, turning into a guttural growl, a hungry, abyssal sound. His head pulsed with a blinding pain, and a sudden, violent spasm racked his body, sending him crashing to the floor. He lay there, gasping, staring up at the ceiling, which seemed to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. This wasn't just a threat anymore, it was a choice. A horrifying, impossible choice. He could surrender, allow the entity to consume him, to break through into this reality fully. Or he could fight, use the knowledge his grandfather had left him, and make the ultimate sacrifice. He would not let it win. He would find that remote monastery. And he would end this, one way or another. The words blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again before Dean's eyes. His grandfather's cryptic entries, once maddeningly vague, now coalesced into a horrifying clarity, like patterns emerging from a dense fog. The journal lay open on the scarred table, its aged pages crackling faintly in the oppressive quiet. This wasn't about a pact with a distant, abstract horror. It was about him. The air outside thickened, pressing against the cottage walls as if the very atmosphere had turned viscous. A low, guttural moan resonated from the island's interior, a sound unlike any wind or wave, a living, suffering thing. Dean stumbled to the window, peering out into a world suddenly twisted. The perpetual fog had deepened, curdling into a yellowish-gray shroud that swallowed the distant coastline. Rain, thick and oily, began to lash the panes, not falling, but streaking sideways, as if gravity itself had begun to warp. He saw it then. The island, his refuge, was transforming. The hardy gorse bushes along the cliff path writhed, their thorns elongating, glistening with an unnatural moisture that wasn't rain. The rocky outcrops, familiar landmarks, now seemed to bulge and recede, their surfaces slick with a sheen that caught the dying light in an unsettling, almost organic way. A flock of gulls, usually raucous and bold, spiraled erratically overhead, their cries hoarse and broken, before plunging into the tumultuous waves with suicidal abandon. The entity. It wasn't merely stirring, it was reaching. The terrible sacrifice wasn't just a cost, it was the mechanism of the pact, the anchor. And he was the anchor. The bloodline. He was the final link, the last vessel. The journal had revealed the true price, not death, but absorption, a final, complete surrender of self to ensure the creature's return to slumber, or at least, its temporary satiation. A desperate, icy resolve hardened within Dean. He wouldn't become a sacrifice. He wouldn't be consumed. His grandfather, for all his failings, had hinted at a counter-ritual, a way to sever the connection, to force the entity back without feeding it. The final, hidden pages of the journal, tucked beneath a false bottom, detailed a complex series of actions, items, and precise locations. One place stood out, underlined repeatedly in faded ink, the remote monastery. He moved with a grim purpose, gathering the items specified, a length of his grandfather's fishing net, aged and smelling faintly of brine and decay, a small, tarnished silver compass that always spun erratically when pointed eastward, a shard of obsidian he'd found on the beach, unnaturally smooth and black, and a vial of his own blood. Drawn with a trembling hand, a sharp, metallic tang filling his nostrils. The journey to the remote monastery was a descent into a waking nightmare. The rain, now mixed with fine, stinging grit, scoured his face. The very ground seemed to resist him, the earth squelching beneath his boots, the path dissolving into a treacherous morass of mud and grasping, mutated roots. Trees along the way, once stoic sentinels, now clawed at the air with gnarled, blackened branches, their leaves shriveled and coated in a glistening, viscous slime. He saw flashes of movement in the churning waves below, colossal shapes breaking the surface, only to vanish again, their passage marked by frothing turbulence and a sickening, fishy odor that permeated the air. He pushed on, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning, the entity's presence a crushing weight in his mind, trying to overwhelm him, to make him stumble, to make him surrender before he even reached his destination. Finally, through the swirling chaos, the remote monastery loomed. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a ruin not merely weathered by time but gnawed by something far older and more malevolent. Its stone walls, once meticulously carved, were now pitted and scarred, covered in a creeping, phosphorescent moss that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. The entity's true power seemed to coalesce within these crumbling walls, a palpable, suffocating pressure that made Dean's teeth ache. He stood before the threshold, the journal clutched in his hand, the ritual items heavy in his pockets. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to turn back, to succumb to the crushing despair. But he remembered the cost, the true horror of absorption, of being merely a note in a symphony of ancient hunger. He would not be consumed. He would fight. The counter-ritual began now. The final pages spoke not of escape, but of a binding. A permanent seal, maintained by a living anchor. And the key, the true method, lay not in the cottage, but in a place his grandfather had only ever hinted at with dread, the remote monastery. He understood now. He gathered what he could, his grandfather's heavy, leather-bound journal, a rusted iron lantern, and a thick length of rope. The cottage air tasted of salt and decay, but beneath it, a new tang, metallic and sharp, pricked his nostrils. The entity was stirring, its presence thickening around the island like a shroud. The journey to the remote monastery was a nightmare of sound and sensation. The fog had swallowed the path, turning the familiar landscape into a featureless gray expanse. Each step was a plunge into an unknown, the ground beneath his worn boots slick with ancient moss. The wind, usually a mournful sigh, now howled with a malicious edge, tearing at his clothes. He heard things in the swirling mist, not just the shriek of gulls, but deeper, guttural sounds that vibrated through the very bones of the island. He felt eyes on him, a crushing pressure that made his scalp prickle. The heavy oak doors, studded with rusted iron, sagged on their hinges. A profound stillness hung in the air, broken only by the drip of water from unseen eaves and the relentless, hungry roar of the distant ocean. He followed the grandfather's cryptic directions, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He passed empty cells, a crumbling refectory, finally reaching a small, circular chamber deep within the monastery's foundations. Here, on a stone pedestal, lay a single, obsidian shard. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, black as the deepest trench, yet somehow luminous. As Dean reached for it, a voice, ancient and resonant, echoed through the chamber, seemingly from the very stones themselves. It was the entity, mocking him, taunting him, trying to claw its way into his mind. Memories twisted, faces of lost loved ones flashed before his eyes, contorted into expressions of accusation and fear. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head, forcing the images away. This was the reveal. This shard wasn't just a key, it was a fragment of the entity itself, a piece that could be turned against its source, but only at an unimaginable cost. The bloodline was not just a lineage of keepers, it was a lineage of vessels. He seized the shard. A jolt, like ice water through his veins, shot up his arm. He felt a profound shift within himself, a sudden, terrible clarity, and a growing emptiness. This was it. The sacrifice had begun. Dean stumbled back out into the fog, the obsidian shard clutched tight. The journey back to the lighthouse was an agonizing ascent. The island pulsed with a malevolent rhythm. The very ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, and the air grew thick, shimmering with an unseen energy. The lighthouse beam, usually a comforting sweep of light, was now erratic, flickering, struggling against an unseen force. He reached the lighthouse, its stone walls groaning under an immense, invisible pressure. The door to the lamproom was torn from its hinges, splintered wood scattered across the landing. The air inside was thick with the entity's presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on his lungs. The smell of brine was overpowering, mixed with the sharp tang of ozone and something rotten, something that spoke of things too long buried. The lamproom was a maelstrom. The great lens, usually a polished beacon, was crazed with cracks, weeping a viscous, black fluid. It pulsed, expanded, contracted, threatening to tear the very fabric of the lighthouse apart. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forced his feet forward. His grandfather's ritual, half remembered from the journal, was a sequence of movements, incantations, and a final, terrible act. He began to chant, the words scraped from a part of his mind he hadn't known existed, an echo of generations past. As he chanted, the vortex recoiled slightly, a shriek of inhuman rage tearing through the air. The physical attacks began. The lighthouse swayed, stone dust raining down. Loose gears from the lamp mechanism spun wildly, flung across the room. He braced himself, his body aching, his mind screaming under the assault. He raised the obsidian shard, its blackness now seeming to drink the sickly green light. This was the profound personal sacrifice. But Dean pushed back, a primal, desperate will rising from deep within him. He thought of the solitude he had sought, the peace he had yearned for, and knew that this was the only way to truly secure it, not for himself, but for the world beyond the island. With a guttural cry, Dean plunged the obsidian shard into the heart of the swirling vortex. There was a blinding flash of black light, a sound like the world tearing itself in half. The entity shrieked, a sound of agony and fury that ripped through Dean's very soul. His vision swam, his knees buckled. The vortex began to shrink, to twist inward, collapsing upon itself. The black fluid weeping from the lens receded. The impossible colors faded, replaced by the familiar, if still sickly, green of the lamp. The roars subsided into a low, mournful moan that echoed from the deep. The portal was sealed. The cost was everything. The words "the bloodline" and "a terrible sacrifice" were not just etched on the page, they were branded onto Dean's mind. His breath hitched, a dry rasp in the suffocating silence of the cottage. It wasn't just a pact, it was an inheritance, a generational debt paid in flesh and sanity. Dean felt a cold, spreading dread that had nothing to do with the island's chill and everything to do with the understanding blooming in his chest. He looked at the final drawing, a crudely rendered map of the island, with a single X marking a submerged cave near the old pier. Around it, scrawled in a frantic hand, were symbols he now recognized from the ancient texts, binding runes, wards against the tide. He wasn't sure if he was meant to be the sacrifice or the new guardian, but he knew he couldn't simply wait for the tide to claim him. The deep song was no longer a distant hum, it was a thrumming vibration beneath the floorboards, a siren call promising oblivion. He gathered a few essentials, a waterproof lantern, a coil of rope, and the journal itself, tucked into his oilskin coat. The wind outside howled, a mournful dirge that seemed to carry fragments of the deep song on its currents. The fog had thickened, pressing against the windows like a vast, hungry spirit, eager to swallow the light. The walk to the old pier was a blur of wind-whipped rain and the relentless, gnawing sound. Each step felt heavy, as if the island itself were trying to hold his back, or perhaps pull him deeper into its embrace. The X on the map led him to a cluster of barnacle-encrusted rocks, half submerged at low tide. He could discern the faint outline of a cave mouth, a black maw slurping at the churning water. The air here was thick with the scent of brine and something else, something ancient and metallic, like rusted blood. He lit the lantern, its feeble glow struggling against the encroaching gloom. He imagined it as 1,000 voices, weeping and rejoicing in the same breath, a chorus of unfathomable hunger. He swallowed, the taste of salt and fear on his tongue. He understood. Not a lack of noise, but a cessation of resistance, a surrender that wasn't quite surrender. He had to listen without hearing, to open himself without being consumed. He took a deep, shuddering breath and plunged into the frigid water. He swam towards the cave, his limbs sluggish, weighted by an unseen force. The water here was calmer, pooling in a deep basin. The deep song pulsed, filling the space, vibrating through the very rock. Dean closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to focus on the rhythm of his own heart. It was an agonizing process. He felt memories, not his own, surge and recede. Images of vast, lightless plains beneath the ocean, of colossal shapes moving with impossible grace. Then, a shift. The cacophony didn't lessen, but it changed. It became ordered. A pattern emerged, a rhythm that was both alien and strangely familiar, like the beating of a monstrous heart. He was becoming a tuning fork, a resonance chamber. This was the sacrifice. Not death, but a transformation, a permanent alteration of his very being. But the world was irrevocably changed. The deep song was no longer an external assault, it was an internal hum, a low, constant thrumming in the back of his consciousness. He understood, with a profound and terrifying clarity, that the immediate threat was neutralized because he was now part of the mechanism that contained it. He was the new ward, the new anchor. He made his way back to the cottage in a daze, the rain still falling, the wind still howling, but it all seemed distant, muted. The island felt like an extension of himself, and he, an extension of the island. He spent the next few days in a fog of exhaustion and a strange, quiet understanding. He packed a small bag, leaving everything else behind. The cottage, the journal, the maps, they belonged to the island now. He left the island on the next supply boat, a silent figure among the few fishermen. The captain, a grizzled man who rarely spoke, gave him a long, assessing look but said nothing. Dean knew he looked different. His eyes probably held a distant, ancient light. Weeks later, Dean found himself in a remote monastery nestled high in the mountains, far from any ocean. He had sought out a place of profound quiet, hoping to drown out the incessant hum, the deep song that now lived within him. He sat in the sparse, stone chapel, the cold air doing little to numb the constant vibration. The monks, cloaked figures moving with serene purpose, observed him with a quiet curiosity, sensing perhaps that he carried a different kind of burden than their own. He would never truly escape the island. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes, but at the cost of his former self. His future was an endless expanse of fog, and somewhere, deep within him, the ancient entity stirred, content for now, knowing its pact was honored, and its psalm would never truly cease.